afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
Well, my name is Brian O'Regan. We're in Scotts Valley, California. Today is August 15th, 2019.
Yes.
And I'm here to talk about my experience with the Loma Prieta earthquake almost 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
You know, like most people, it started out with just a really nice day. You know, October 17th, you know how the weather here can be. It's amazing. And it was just one of those amazing, perfect days. And I was at work at the fire department here in Scotts Valley with Scotts Valley Fire District. And it was the end of the workday for us. You know, we have a normal workday, but of course we spend our nights at the station for calls and all that. And we would work a series of 3 shifts, and then we would have a couple of days off, and it was our 3rd shift. And it was the A's playing the Giants in the World Series, so we were feeling kind of like we were going to celebrate having both our teams in the championship. So we had put in a little extra money for our food for the dinner, because that's what we do in the fire department. We pay for our own food. Yeah, and so a lot of people don't know that, but anyway, we put in a little extra that night. We were going to have, we were going to have steak and prawns. We were going to have this big dinner. We were going to watch the World Series. And so my engine company, who was, I think the captain was Mike Finn, and the driver was Greg McNeil, and I was the firefighter. I was only in the department for about 2 years. And we'd gone to the store to go shop, and we were on our way back, and we were backing into the station. And as we were backing in, right as we were crossing the threshold of where the door is, the engine started to shake like crazy. And the driver started to laugh. He thought somebody had jumped on the tailboard and started jumping up and down. But I could tell by the noise, because in those days we sat outside the engine, kind of in a semi-covered area, but still outside, and we faced backwards, and I was right underneath where the door was, and I could tell by the sound, this was not somebody jumping on the engine. This was an earthquake right away. So I started telling, hey, it's an earthquake, we gotta get out. And our job then is anytime there's an earthquake, we have to pull all the equipment out of the station, so that, you know, in case there's more, we don't lose all of our equipment inside the station. It's not gonna do anybody good there.
Right.
So Greg started pulling out immediately, but I couldn't wait. He was taking too long for me. So I, you know, in that momentary time when he was between reverse and drive, I jumped off the engine, but I still had my headsets on, because that's how we communicated, and I'd left it on, and it actually kind of pulled me back. Luckily not into the engine, but as it let go, he took off, and I remember the ground was still shaking, but I looked up toward where the city hall is for Scotts Valley, away from our station on Urban Lane. I could see the wave going up into the hills, and as it went up, you could see like the dust and the dirt going on. And it seemed like a long time, but it was a short amount of time. And I remember our captain just going, "Wow, that was amazing!" And I was just shaking. I couldn't believe it. And at that point, the other drivers, I wasn't a driver at that point. The other drivers were pulling the rigs out too, and I could still see the rigs moving on the ground, still. And I remember our Chief Scott, came out at the time, and we knew at that point it was a bad earthquake. And a lot of our families lived in Santa Cruz and stuff, and I just remember the chief coming out and going, "No one's going home, no one leaves," because he didn't want anyone to panic to go find our wives, because I was newly married, only a couple of months, and my wife worked in downtown Santa Cruz. And right after that, we could hear the radio traffic coming on, and we could hear someone in Santa Cruz saying, we've sustained major damage, and then we could hear somebody out in Watsonville Hospital with, at that time, Freedom Volunteer Fire Department. You could hear somebody screaming on the radio that they had major damage out there. And I remember our captain, Mike Finn, coming up on the radio and going, because our dispatch center was underneath the county building at that time, and you could tell they were upset. Obviously they were in the basement, but they stayed there.
Oh, God.
And I remember our captain, Mike Finn, going, "Are you guys okay?" And they were like, "Yeah, we're okay. We're holding okay." But they probably wanted to get out of that building and as bad as they could, but they stayed there the whole time. Anyhow, so pretty shortly after that, we started getting calls ourselves. And our first call that we went on, just our engine company, we went up to a road, I believe it's Deer Path Road, it's been a while since I worked for Scotts Valley. It's off of Cadillac Drive, Deer Path Road area in there. And there was a house built on the hillside, and it basically catapulted down the hill with, I believe, the woman who lived there. She was in the house, and I think her husband was outside when it happened. He saw the whole thing go down with her in it. But miraculously, she only had 2 broken legs, but she was alive. So we got there, and her husband at the time, he was doing everything he could to get her up the hill, but he started having an asthmatic attack. And so the poor guy, he's struggling to breathe. So we went down, and a couple of us with some other neighbors, it's amazing how everyone came together, was that they dragged her up the hill, and our captain, Mike, he knew there were no ambulances available. He asked if there weren't any. But somebody drove up with the pickup truck, and we just loaded her in the pickup truck, and we just sent her off to the hospital. And then I was left with the husband down the hill, and as I'm trying to help him, he's walking, but I'm kind of helping him. That we're having aftershocks now, and little bits of rocks are coming down at us. And at this point, I basically just grabbed him. I dragged him up the hill. I didn't want to be up there down in the canyon anymore. And then while we were doing that, of course, one of our other engine companies, they went on a fire off of Graham Hill Road somewhere. So we left there to go help them. And as we left, you could see columns of smoke coming up everywhere. And we still didn't know where the earthquake had originated. We thought, it had to be down in Hollister or somewhere where it's always pretty active down there. We had no idea it was so close to where we were. So we spent the rest of that evening going from call to call. Some were very minor. I think people were just glad to see that the system was still working. Seeing us, driving around in the fire truck. Of course, there were no lights. There was no, the infrastructure was kind of broken at that point. And that's why I think people were so relieved to see that we were still out there. At that point, we started also having people from Seagate, was still a pretty big company in Scotts Valley, and a lot of their employees who lived over the hill, they weren't going to get home because we knew that there had been a really large landslide off of Laurel Road, which is pretty much what gave rise to the Highway 17 commuter buses. Because for the time that road was closed, that was the only way people could get over it, was with these commuter buses. And once they finally got the road cleared enough for that. Anyhow, we started having a lot of employees coming over to this fire department because we had a big generator. They saw lights, and they figured, okay, I'm going to go hang out there. And we had a lot of their employees spend the night at the fire station, just on the floors, wherever they could find a place to lay down. And we had them there. Trying to think of what else might have happened that day. Oh, of course, I didn't know where my wife was. I was scared out of my mind that something bad had happened because we were hearing all the reports. And I always told my wife, if something bad ever happens downtown, just get in your car and get out of there. Because I always thought there would be like looting, but that never happened. A lot of the people that I thought might have been the problem, they actually helped. It was actually an amazing time to see how people came together. Everyone was equal at that time. So it was cool in that way.
Yeah. So you worked for Scotts Valley Fire Department.
Mm-hmm.
How long had you lived here in Santa Cruz, or did you grow up here?
I grew up here. So I spent my childhood up on the Summit Road area from the time I was a baby. And then in 1977, when I was 13, we moved down into Santa Cruz because I was the youngest of 6, and my brothers and sisters were beginning to move out, and our family was getting smaller at that time. So my parents just decided, let's just move back down. Let's move down in town. And I had other family cousins that lived in Santa Cruz. So then I ended up doing all of high school and all that stuff in Santa Cruz.
Okay. So let's see, where are we? To go back to that first house that you went to, the house that fell down the hill, basically.
Yeah.
How did your unit know to go there?
So the 911 system was still working. People were still able to call. How, I'm not sure at this point, because I do remember there was a breakdown in the phone system. I do remember that people could call from outside the area in, but for people to call out, they couldn't. So I don't honestly know how people were calling the 911 system. But like I said, the dispatchers were still there. So somehow they were able to get a hold of them. And so our system was still working. So we were still getting dispatched calls.
In a moment like that, where there's likely lots of people calling 911, how do you prioritize where you go?
I think, the way they prioritize it is life. and then property. So if they felt that there was lives in danger, then of course, then we would be prioritized that. Once, and if, these kinds of situations can cause a person to have a heart attack or to cause them to have other illnesses. So even though there might be a house on fire, once we're dispatched to somebody who's having a heart attack, we have to keep going to that. That becomes the priority. We could run out of units very quickly. So triaging the calls became very important.
Now, you were on your rig right as the fire, or right as the earthquake hit. Did you experience anything emotionally, physically, or spiritually in that moment where you're like, oh, it's an earthquake, this is what's happening? Or even immediately after?
I think one of the things that hit me first was, I can't believe this is already happening in my career. Because that's one of those career type situations that, you hear about. And it never did happen after that for the rest of my career, because I ended up doing 31 years in the fire department. And so I never experienced thank goodness, I never experienced another earthquake like that again. So I do remember thinking, wow, I can't believe this is, already happening. And then, the thought also of my wife not knowing where she was until probably 8 o'clock I remember it was after dark when I finally found out she was okay. So that was hard to stay at work, and I wanted to go find her. And then also just the way people, like I mentioned before, how they came together. And it's really incredible. There's nothing like a good natural disaster to bring people together.
Unfortunately, sometimes
yeah,
that's what it takes.
It is. It really is.
Yeah. Did the earthquake impact your life in any significant way after?
Yeah.
After that?
Yeah, because up to that point, earthquakes were always kind of fun. Oh, earthquake, that was a good one. Yeah. After that, it was like, oh, holy, it's an earthquake. And they were not fun anymore. They were real. And, as much as, people who've never been through a big one kind of go, oh, they're not that big of a deal. When you feel a real one, it's a big deal. And so ever since then, it just hasn't been the same in that way. And that, when I do feel one, my heart still starts beating like it did at that time, call it PTSD or whatever. And it was worse, for my wife in a lot of ways, because she was in downtown Santa Cruz. It was so much louder down there. And she ran out of a building as glass came down behind her. So she really, barely survived that earthquake. And so for her, it affects her even worse, which in turn affects me. Because if she's dealing with it, then so am I. So luckily we're still together, so.
Good, that's good.
Yeah.
That's great. You mentioned that people banding together was a big sort of silver lining of this whole thing. How do you think the earthquake impacted the Santa Cruz community as a whole?
Wow. Sadly, I think the working together part went away fairly quickly. People went back to their lives and things like that. And it has such a, people are there in Santa Cruz for a couple of years and they move away. So a lot of people that were there during that time are probably gone now. It affected Santa Cruz a lot, though, physically. I mean, if you've been around Santa Cruz for a while, if you were here before the earthquake, the whole downtown area is very different. And the biggest sword through the heart was when the Cooper house came down. I'm sure you hear that a lot. That was such a blow to the downtown, to the community, to the heart and soul of Santa Cruz. And they acted so quickly. That still bothers me to this day. Because they saved other buildings, and that building could have probably been saved. But anyhow, so that is a way that it affected the city in itself.
Did you have close ties with the Cooper house?
I did, yeah. My mom used to work down there. To me, the Cooper house was always Christmas. The smells and all that stuff. And I would always go down there when I didn't feel like Christmas was here, I'd go there.
Aww.
Yeah. And so it's gone.
That's sweet. So being a firefighter, having had emergency training, and living through an earthquake, do you take any precautions against natural disasters now?
Yeah.
Yeah?
That's a good question. I think about it a lot.
Do you?
And you know, like everyone else, as time goes on, you lose that urgency. And my wife and I still say, wow, we should really have this and we should really have that. But one of the things that I did do a long time ago, was we camped and I bought a tent trailer, and I always thought this would be a really great thing to have if a big earthquake comes. And one of the reasons why I don't like the thought of selling it someday is that it's because no one wanted to be in their house right after the earthquake. And so this would give us a place where we could still be, and we still use it, but you know, it'd be a great option to have outside the house. It's got a place to cook. It would just give us a place to kind of, for a couple days before we're ready to go back inside.
Right.
Yeah.
Was your house affected?
No, we were really lucky. The west side, which is where I live in Santa Cruz, seemed pretty solid ground. All the areas that were built on old estuaries, the Marina District, downtown Santa Cruz, parts of Watsonville, those were the places that were really badly affected. Yeah.
All the liquefaction.
Yes. Yeah.
And everything.
Yeah. So the west side was pretty well. It was pretty good. Because there could be another time.
So you went back into your house?
I was allowed to go back home 2 days later.
Okay.
Once I knew my wife was okay and my family were okay, I was okay, I'm fine. I can hang out here as long as they need me to. But then I went home, and I got home, and at that time, the house that we owned, we had only owned it for a little while. My wife and I lived in the studio over the garage, and I remember going in there, and only a couple pieces of things had fallen over. I mean, there was no cracks. We were very lucky, you know. So I'm thankful for that. So, and I do remember seeing like a lot of tents in people's front yards and stuff. Still, 2 days later.
How long did you get stuck at work for?
That was about 2 days. So about 48 hours, they let us go home just to check on our families. They said, get back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any interesting things happen in that period of time?
I remember driving home. There was no one on Highway 17 because the highway was still closed and people just weren't ready to try to go to work yet.
Sure.
And I remember driving down almost, past Sims Road, getting toward past Tampa, and I remember just this big drop in the highway because it had dropped a little bit. And I remember, whoa, there was no warning, and I remember seeing that. Other than that, I do remember downtown was still all closed off when I remember I wanted to drive by, to see if there was anything going on down there, and it was all blocked off. That day, for a couple hours I had, I remember my wife Dawn and I and my parents went downtown. We parked far away. We tried to walk in, and I remember this truck pulling up, and it was the Sentinel, and they were handing out free newspapers, and they got, I believe the San Jose Mercury got the Sentinel, because back then they printed the paper down on Center Street, Church Street, and where Looker is now, I think, or anyway, it doesn't matter. But the San Jose Mercury allowed them to print their paper, and then they brought it back over, and then they were just handing out to anybody. I remember grabbing. I still have those papers. Oh, yeah, I should have brought them in. But anyway, so everybody. It was like God. It was like the old days. Like give me a paper, to get information, because there really wasn't much. The phones weren't working that well, and the radio was still usable, but it wasn't like local news. Everything was out of San Francisco at that point still. Yeah.
So a lot of people that I've spoken to talk about using car radio or battery-powered radio as their primary source of information. Do you find that to be more or less accurate?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. It kind of makes me think about what will happen today if there's a big earthquake, because a lot of our information comes from the internet, and a lot of those modes of internet travel are on these towers and things, and the earthquakes have knocked those out, and no one's going to have radios anymore except for their car radios, hopefully. But yeah, I think it'll be a little harder for us to get our information today if we have something pretty major happen.
Is there anything else you would like to add that we didn't cover? What is it like to reflect back 30 years?
It's amazing.
Later?
It's been 30 years. I can't believe it's been 30 years. Yeah, it's funny to think that was the beginning of my career, and now I retired almost a year ago. Now it's the end of my career. you know, I wanted to be able to pass off just this information because in, 40, 50 years, it'll all be gone. It'd be nice to have this information. I think your question about, do I still try to remain ready for another earthquake? I think that's something that we all really need to do a little bit. We should have a little cash. We should have some water, or we should know where to get the water if our water faucet doesn't work. We should have at least that information, and to know your neighbors would be a really good thing too. I know for people these days it's getting harder, and it would be really good to have your neighbors, because then you can lean on them a little bit. You can at least pool your resources together. Yeah, I wish I could give you more than that.
No, that's fantastic. I think that's part of what we want to get at is,
Yeah.
Like it's going to happen again.
Yeah.
They have said pretty definitively, yeah, we're in store for another earthquake.
Yeah.
That's just the way that the ground is built
Oh, yeah.
nowadays, so to speak. And I think it's really important that people do have this sort of concept of what it means to be ready for something, whether it's an earthquake or a wildfire.
Well, that's the thing too. There's any kind of natural disasters can hit us, because in the last 30 years, it hasn't been just earthquakes.
Right.
And we've had floods, and we've had fires, and all that stuff.
Yeah, Santa Cruz is prime real estate for natural disaster. We're just lucky that it hasn't been too big.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so I really appreciate you sharing your story